Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 15th of November 2021. I am joined as ever by my, apparently benefiting from a soon-to-be greatly upgraded rail network in the south of England, Mr. Andy Brockman. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning. Actually, we're within a couple of miles of the new East Thames tunnel crossing, which is being built, and nobody can think why increase road capacity at a time when you're trying to discourage people from using the roads. But anyway, that's another story.
It's almost as though there's no joined-up thinking about our infrastructure, and actually, this may be, in all seriousness, this may be a story that we talk about in the next month or so, because the HS2 high-speed rail link that was going to connect different parts of the country has been grossly reduced, or will be certainly grossly reduced in announcements today from government, and that will have an impact on commercial archaeology in Britain. But regardless of that, and that unfolding news story, our ongoing Watching Brief, our mission continues to discuss the archaeological news of the week and bring it here to you guys to discuss and augment below with your conversation and commentary. And this week we have an opening gambit about the Parthenon marbles, or the Elgin marbles so-called. And then we have a follow-up, which was actually inspired by a tweet, but leads quite nicely into a realm that we'll probably be touching on in more detail and very specifically next week. So strap in and we shall begin. So number one for the week, our first story. We'll
start with the non-controversial one.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, starting with the one that's not remotely controversial. This is a headline from The Guardian to kick us off. Return of the Parthenon marbles is up to the British Museum, says Number 10. Spokesperson's comments before Boris Johnson was set to meet the Greek Prime Minister appear to signal a softening of position when it comes to relinquishing potentially the marbles back to Athens. Returning the Parthenon marbles to Greece is a matter for the British Museum, Downing Street has said, and apparently this is reversing a long-standing UK government position to the idea, reiterated by Boris Johnson as recently as March. So does that mean?
Can I just point out?
Go ahead.
Can I just point out here? Far be it from me to suggest that Downing Street is being a bit disingenuous here,
Okay.
But they are.
Yeah. In what way? Go on.
No, I mean, well, look. New viewer, start here.
Mm-hmm. You might have heard of the Parthenon marbles and the British Museum. You might have heard about that, but anyway, go on.
Absolutely. In a deal that would have been envied by one, Dr. Jones of that famous museum, Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to the Sublime Porte of the Ottoman Empire, did a deal in Athens in the early 19th century to recover some of the Parthenon frieze.
Yeah.
And the deal was done. The material was exported to the UK. Faced with bankruptcy, apparently, Lord Elgin attempted to sell it to the relatively then new British Museum. The deal was vetted to see that he did actually have legal ownership and title, and it satisfied the lawyers of the time. And the Parthenon marbles were absorbed into the British Museum's collection. Forward to
it should be said, before we fast forward, it should be said that supposedly Elgin observed the poor state of the marbles. He was struck by how the poor state of the Parthenon monument. At the time, it was being used as army barracks, and supposedly soldiers from the Ottoman Empire were using the frieze as target practice. So they were taking pot shots at the marbles. So apparently this was part of his reason. He'd gone there to observe and to draw them, and he decided to try and purchase them. So I just thought I'd just mention that. So it's a circumstance. Yeah.
This is and actually you're correct by that. It's one of those circumstances where we're dealing with a lot of contentious history, but there are broad agreements on the actual origins of the purchase. And I think we have to bear in mind as well that Elgin is operating within that classical tradition of the Grand Tour. Classical civilization is the precursor to Western civilization, and so on. So yeah, this is we mustn't discount a genuinely idealistic motive for wanting to preserve them on his part. It was the fact that he wanted to preserve them in London, not in Athens, that is the contentious issue.
Yeah. But also, I can't believe I'm making so many defences here of his actions. But also, it should be borne in mind as well. At the time, correctly or incorrectly, he had good reason to think that London was the inheritor of Western civilization. The British Empire was in ascendancy, and they very much saw themselves as custodians of the legacy of the classical world. So, again, little caveats. But let's fast forward now. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so we'll fast forward to the late 20th century, and the Greek government. And remember, the state of Greece didn't exist at the time that Elgin made his deal with the Ottoman Empire. So most famously, actually, the actor and then culture minister Melina Mercouri began to campaign to have the marbles returned to Athens. The Greeks have built a fabulous museum at the foot of the Acropolis to house what remained of the Parthenon friezes after Elgin had taken the material that formed part of the sculpture display. And it's been an ongoing cultural touchstone, really, between the British government, the Greek government, and the museum and archaeology community for the last 40 years or so.
Yeah.
And the latest iteration of the argument has come because Boris Johnson, British Prime Minister, famously styles himself as a classicist, studied classics at Oxford, often likes to quote himself. One of his favourite historical characters is Pericles, who, of course, was instrumental in creating the Acropolis as we know it now. But he was due to meet the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis this week. And ahead of the talks, Mr. Mitsotakis made it clear that he was going to raise the issue of the Parthenon marbles being returned to Greece. The other piece of background that our viewer needs to be aware of is, as we've mentioned before when we've covered this on Watching Brief, that the British Museum collection is protected by law. The trustees can't deaccession material without basically a change in the law, unless it's a duplicate or various other strict criteria are in place.
Yeah.
And that's really why I'm saying Downing Street saying it's an issue for the trustees is they're being disingenuous. As things stand at the moment, if the board of trustees of the British Museum wanted to return the Parthenon marbles to Athens, they could only do so in terms of relinquishing ownership if the law was changed, and that requires an initiative from government.
Yes.
Now, there are other ways it could be accomplished, like, for example, they could choose possibly to loan material. And in that sense, they do have more agency, perhaps, than might have been thought. And
well, they
there
do,
are
but
hints here
but
that
presumably in accepting a loan, the recipient is also accepting the ownership of the person who is loaning.
Precisely.
Or the body who is loaning.
Precisely the problem.
Yeah.
That's precisely the problem.
Yeah.
Now, it would appear...
So, well, that in addition to the fact that you appear to have a nuclear reactor outside your window at the moment.
Now, actually, it's my halo, and you're lucky you're not close enough. You can smell my odour of sanctity as well.
Blinded by your holiness and your enlightenment.
I'm going to be carried off in a fiery chariot in a moment.
Yep.
Ancient aliens.
Sweet low, sweet. So go on.
This is a very serious subject.
It is very serious.
Yeah. Okay. Serious face. Now, the point is that there were hints that there might be, for example, some sort of quid pro quo It's been suggested, and in fact, it's caused some problems apparently in the Greek media. That, for example, the British Museum might be loaned, in exchange for sending back the Parthenon marbles, might be loaned, for example, material that's never previously left Greece, like, for example, the so-called Golden Mask of Agamemnon that was found by Schliemann at Mycenae.
Right.
So, yeah, because again, one of the criticisms of the potential return has been, well, it would leave a huge hole, well, a very large room, empty room in the British Museum, and how would they fill it? And then there are other things as well, like the precedent that's being set for is every single item a contested item? People argue that actually the purchase at the time was perfectly legal. So under international law, the Greeks can call on goodwill, but they can't. They don't have a legal standing in terms of trying to get this material back to Athens.
But it's interesting though that Johnson moved to shift the focus of this conversation, presumably away from a face-to-face dismissal of the notion of a return. The Greek Prime Minister at a gathering at the Science Museum within an hour of meeting Boris Johnson said, "My intention is to continue working hard until the Parthenon Marble's final return to the Acropolis Museum is complete." On Wednesday, Greek officials downplayed Johnson's insistence that the issue was a matter for the British Museum to resolve, calling his stance utterly predictable. Is that essentially saying he was passing the buck, being slightly I don't know, maybe a bit of a coward in that sense? The current Prime Minister of Greece is the first to have formally raised the Parthenon marbles actually at Downing Street, and echoing his conviction that the campaign should now prioritise UK citizens. He actually made an appearance on Good Morning Britain, one of the UK's main morning TV shows, to which actually seemingly there was a very positive response. He's now basically shifting towards the notion that, to quote, "it will be the British public opinion that decisively tips the scales in the favour of the just Greek demand." And actually, sorry, that was a member of the Greek delegation that said that. And is that really where we're moving towards? Because we've also seen in recent months and years a growing international consensus and acts of reparation and restoration of, for example, the aspects of the Benin bronzes. Various museums here in the UK, museums in Europe, museums in America are sort of starting to promise to return what they have, growing seemingly public opinion and pressure against institutions like the British Museum on that front. Is he on to a winner, the Greek Prime Minister?
Look, Mitsotakis himself said that, this is a quote, "museums around the world are increasingly working to share, return, reunite, or lend exhibits on an unprecedented scale." And he's absolutely right about that. And we've even seen in the commercial world, we've seen sales, for example, of material, cultural material belonging to native peoples, which was allegedly stolen. We've seen sales stopped in a number of auction houses in the past few years. So this is an argument where the goalposts have moved, and I think many people would say quite rightly have moved. People are examining the ethics of how museum collections were built up over the years, and whether it is appropriate to display, let alone retain, certain material. As I say,
particularly when they could be framed in some cases as the spoils of war, for example.
Yes, which these aren't. It has to be said. The Parthenon marbles are not the spoils of war.
But the Benin
they're the spoils
bronzes.
The Benin bronzes are. Yes, absolutely. There's no question about that.
No.
But the situation, as I say, really is a legal one and a matter of will. Boris Johnson not wanting to make a decision on this. Well, as the Guardian points out in its coverage, when he was involved in the Oxford Union in the 1980s, Melina Mercouri, who I mentioned earlier, the Greek culture minister, was invited to speak about this subject and actually won a vote at the Oxford Union among the now many of whom are the great and the good of British government, British culture, that the marble should be returned. So I suspect in the long term, some kind of arrangement will be made.
Yeah.
But I don't, I may be completely wrong in this, but there are the legal hurdles. Now, the other thing that we need to factor, well, just quickly, the other thing we need to factor into this is that the Board of Trustees of the British Museum have a new chair.
Well, I was just about to ask, could it be that Johnson sees the new chair as a safe pair of hands?
The new chair, for people who, again, missed our coverage of it at the time, is the former Chancellor of the Exchequer and senior Conservative politician, George Osborne. And so there you have a politician and someone whose reputation was partly built on political strategy and being able to play the political game. And
bisecting the heritage sector in this country. But we'll put
that's another story.
Yeah.
Look, people are placed on the board of the British Museum because they have a certain amount of expertise in various areas, not just classical archaeology. I mean, another member of the board is Mary Beard, the famous classicist. So, look, who knows? The board operates within the current legal constraints, but it is perfectly within its rights to talk to its counterparts, say at the Parthenon Museum in Athens, and come up with an arrangement, a mutually agreeable arrangement, which it can then put to government. And I think that's what's going on here. What they're trying to do, what Johnson was trying to do, yes, he was trying to. Again, the political context. He's had a difficult couple of weeks, and
but he's doing his best. Sorry,
he's doing his best to avoid the issue. No, okay, it's a niche issue for many people, but some bad headlines about holding on to stolen artwork wouldn't have been, and the Greeks protesting about it wouldn't have been a good look this week on top of everything else.
No.
So what he's done is as he was talking. One colleague on Twitter when I tweeted this out said, "Oh, Johnson's passing the buck then." And to a certain extent, that's true. And as I say, it is disingenuous to say that it's an issue for the trustees because there is that legal constraint which can only be fixed by the government. But
however, though, what one imagines if the trustees come to a fairly, a broad consensus, if not a unanimous decision, that would put pressure on the on institutions to find legal ways forward. So I suppose, actually, what Johnson's has done there, possibly by trying to wriggle out of direct conversation and responsibility, he's actually opened up a pathway forward. And as you say, it's likely, probably, therefore, that something will happen, presumably.
That's right. Look, as I say, compared to any other time, certainly in my adult life, when I've been aware of this particular issue, there's more sympathy for the concepts of restitution, reparation, sharing of material internationally, and so on. So, that's certainly the case in the museum and archaeology world. I would imagine that if you took a poll among museum and archaeology people, there will probably be a majority, certainly for a loan back, if not a full restoration. So, in which case, in a set, this is accepting that the goal, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, the goalposts have moved. The ball is closer to the net. The Greeks have moved the ball closer to the net. I'm remembering, I think it was the 2002 Euros where was it 2000? Anyway, famously in the early noughties, the Greeks won
out of nowhere
the European Championship out of nowhere. 1-0 after a rather dull game, if I remember correctly. But it was a huge moment huge national moment, and I think to take the footballing metaphor, yeah, that's where we are now. They've moved the ball, moved the ball closer to the British Museum goal, and it might get netted sooner rather than later.
Okay, and just I suppose one final thing I would say about this is that I imagine that that something happening would be good all round, if nothing else, because at the moment, whenever one brings up the British Museum in other capacities, for example, on the Archaeosoup Facebook page and Twitter, etc., the first thing you get is a torrent of comments saying, "Well, give stuff back, give the stuff back, you thieves, you British thieves," this kind of thing. If we can try and put that somehow to bed, and if that means finally returning the Parthenon marbles, hopefully we can all start to move on with these issues, and especially move into a different way of doing museum, as it were, and move away from some of these knotty issues, with learning, and with genuine positive intent.
Absolutely. And before I get flamed by our football fan viewer, I just point out that UEFA Euro Championship win was in 2004, not 2002.
Oh, thank goodness! I'm so glad we cleared that up.
I know, but and this is a serious point to end on. A very serious point to end on. At the beginning of that championship, you could have got 150 to 1 on Greece winning. So if you could get those sorts of odds on the return of the Parthenon marbles, I'd put £1 on it.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So Andy has rejigged things in his office, and we're no longer hopefully going to be quite so blinded by his awesomeness. It's
and then actually, I have to correct you there. It was actually the mothership, and I've instructed it to return to Sirius.
Well, you say that, but I keep on now getting the sun at my window. So maybe you've sent the mothership here to blind me. Anyway, our second story of the week was inspired by a tweet that came to my attention from a US-based account, Travis on Twitter, aka at Leftist Dad Jokes, asked a question that seemingly resonated across the world. It was the tweet heard around the world. He asked quite a simple question: why is the pay in contract archaeology so bad? How the American Cultural Resource Association, ACRA, and the US Forest Service suppressed wage increases for archaeological technicians in the 1990s. The cultural resource management CRM industry was locked in a debate on whether archaeological fieldwork was skilled or unskilled labour. And this is absolutely something that we've been talking about in this country in recent months and years, not least with regards to immigration policy and the ability for archaeologists to be classed as skilled labour and therefore able to get into the country to do work that they may in fact be very much required to do. But for a relatively small Twitter account, just over 200 followers, Travis's tweet was garnering a lot of traction here in the US, in Canada, and other places.
That's right. I mean, we won't go into the whole thread now. It's 32 tweets long. It's a detailed resume of how, in a sense, archaeology, or at least the organising bodies in archaeology, and the companies and their representative bodies, arguably, conspired is too strong a word, but certainly cooperated with the funders of archaeology, the commercial funders of archaeology, in government and in industry, to suppress wages and conditions for archaeological field workers, and particularly those on the less well-paid grades. And as you say, it resonated with archaeologists really across the world: Australia, Canada, Europe, and Britain. In Britain, we tend to call it developer-funded archaeology rather than cultural resource management.
Yes.
But it's the same thing. It's archaeology that is done alongside or ahead of usually commercial developments or large government infrastructure projects. Done on the principle that if you can't preserve in situ, you preserve by record.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah.
And on that front of pay in particular, CIFA, the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, as recently as 2018, this isn't the most recent statement on these matters, and we'll come to that in a moment. But in 2018, they issued a series of proclamations based on a review of paying conditions. And, for example, one of the specific recommendations from the trade union prospect was that the board of CIFA considered it, in its deliberations the Living Wage Foundation's real living wage for London. So essentially artificially raising the legal minimum wage in order to allow people, God forbid, to be able to live on the money that they're earning. But the board went on to say this. The board recognised that the market for archaeological services continues to grow and is largely back to pre-recession levels. It only took a decade, it seems, to get to there, and that parts of the UK are experiencing difficulty in recruiting sufficiently skilled archaeologists. It also acknowledged that there are significant regional variations in the market for archaeological services across the UK, as well as considerable concern and uncertainty as to the result of the Brexit vote. It considered Prospect's recommendations of raising the minimum wage or recommending a London living wage at the very least, but concluded that this would constitute a policy departure for the minimum salaries, as it would require substantial increases to be phased in to archaeologists' pay packets. Based on the information above, the board concluded that the minimum salaries should increase from the 1st of April 2018 to, starting at the P-CIFA level, that's the basic pay grade that they outline, £18,600. But
I think it is worth pointing out here though that 18 grand is something like £7,000 less than the current national average.
Exactly. Yeah.
Pay packet.
Yeah, and the reason why this is important though is that this in translation is essentially, we don't want to annoy or disappoint development and developers, the people who are paying for.
No, it's not disappoint; it's annoy. We don't want to frighten developers into thinking they're going to have to pay more money for us when they already don't want to pay for us anyway.
Yeah, so therefore we'll acknowledge that we've been asked to consider advocating a higher minimum wage, but actually we're going to leave that to individual employers rather than advocating on behalf of the archaeologists who pay their subs to be members of this Chartered Institute for Archaeologists. Now, that's interesting in the context of actual the qualifications of archaeologists on the national in the national labour market. In 2019-2020, it was apparently highly statistically likely that archaeologists would be fairly highly qualified. 1% of archaeologists in the labour market have a postdoc qualification. So that means they've done their PhD and everything else that comes before that, and they've gone on to do another qualification. 23% of employed archaeologists, and this will be archaeologists who, for example, maybe I've worked with, who are simply front of house at a museum, perhaps. I know some of these people in this instance.
We all do.
Have a PhD. Well, I know we all do, but in that sense, I literally remember having conversations with people who were like, "I've got a PhD and I'm working in this particular job." Goodness, 44% have a master's and 28% have a BA or BSc level qualification. So we'll include links to these stats and where we got them from below, so you can scrutinise them. But what this boils down to is that within the UK, 96% of archaeologists have at least a BA or BSc level education. 96%. This compares via the Office for National Statistics to only 45% of 21 to 64-year-olds in the same labour market having a BA or BSc basic education and higher. So archaeologists are almost double. In fact, more than double the rate of highly qualified, therefore I would argue highly motivated, highly capable individuals. And yet we are under remunerated for the most part. It seems that the national body that we should rely on to have our back on this issue is for fear of disappointing or frustrating or annoying developers, dragging their heels very much. And yet, I remember when CIFA, who were the IFA, when they were going for that important C, that chartered status, trying to make the case that this would be very important for the profession, and it would put us on the same sort of footing as lawyers and this kind of thing. Does CIFA have our back when it comes to pay and conditions?
Look, I think we need to be careful here. We mustn't lay all the blame at the feet of CIFA.
No.
There's another organisation called FAME, the Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers, which is also very significant in this area. It does what it says on the tin. It represents the interests of archaeological managers, the big companies like Oxford Archaeology and Museum of London Archaeology and the others, Wessex and the others. And they have a huge amount of power on this because they literally hold the purse strings. They are also the ones who put in the tenders and could, if they wanted to, increase their prices.
Yeah.
Thing is, because everything is done on competitive tender, if one company puts up its prices to pay its staff better, guess who's not going to get the gig if the others don't follow suit?
Yeah.
At the same time, there are legal restrictions on, for example, operating as what's called a cartel, so rigging prices across an industry. That's illegal.
Yeah.
So it's not simple.
No.
But on the other hand, the archaeological workforce could, if it wanted to, take the initiative and, for example, take industrial action for higher pay. And that will be nothing. And the mechanism for doing that. Sorry, Marc, I just made this point quickly.
Yep.
That can be done independently of CIFA and of FAME and all of the other bodies that are involved. That if archaeological staff could speak in terms of one, but it's not a heavily unionized sector.
No.
The main union at the moment is the highest profile union of recruiting among archaeologists is Prospect. But at the moment, I think they claim something like just over 1,000 members, which is something like a sixth, probably, of the active archaeological workforce.
Yes. Yeah.
That.
Yeah. Well, and then I mean, I should be clear. I'm not suggesting that CIFA unilaterally alters the market, but rather CIFA could make statements, as they do, on what they believe should be the adequate remuneration for professionals who are, in this instance, members of their body. Their most recent statement from April 2021 raised the lowest level of pay to £20,400. So that's a modest increase over the course of 2 years, but it's still well below the national average. Now, if we compare this to an electrician on a UK building site, someone who is ubiquitous across the sector, who absolutely archaeologists will be bumping into and seeing in and around site. Electricians' day rates at the moment average around £250. I've put a link below to the website How Much electrician rates for 2021, and they range from maybe £200 up to £272. That's the difference between Angus and Aberdeen there. So we've averaged that out at around £250 a day. For an annual rate, that comes out at £65,000. £65,000. Now, I mean, there is an issue here whereby if an electrician gets it wrong, people die. If someone touches a live wire when they shouldn't, or if a circuit is improperly installed, it could cause a fire, it could cause a heart attack, it could, there's a reason why electricians are paid well. But the difference between 65 and 2 years ago, 18, and now just over £20,000 for archaeologists is stark. But I suppose I suppose going to the heart of this question, where should we be looking for guidance and leadership on this? And in fact, are industry leaders within the heritage sector, in this instance in the UK, actually willing to make the case for archaeology being worthwhile paying for? It feels a little bit as though archaeologists run the risk of sounding whiny when actually what they need is to have a fairly reasonable conversation and argument, adequately supported by people who can actually make waves, for example, in Westminster.
Look, there was a very interesting debate within CIFA itself a couple of years ago when the management of CIFA tried to add on top of the existing 3 grades, a 4th grade called chartered archaeologist, taking out the fact that they could they were now allowed to call people chartered archaeologists legally. They got the permission to do the permission from government and Her Majesty to do that. It went to a vote, and the management lost. They couldn't get the required majority to get that adopted. No. And it's really interesting if you look at the breakdown of statistics that were published by CIFA after the extraordinary general meeting in 2019 that discussed this. If you look at the pie chart of people who voted for the proposal, by far the biggest proportion voted because it would enhance parity with other professions, and would enhance the external perception of archaeology, garnering higher respect and status. And also the next highest category of support was people who believed that it would support future development and improvement to the status of archaeologists. Now, conversely, and this was the winning argument, if you like. By far the most people who opposed that proposal felt that it would make archaeology look exclusive, elitist, it would be alienating, and would enhance pay disparity within the workforce. In other words, that people who achieved chartered status could fly off onto the 65 grand and leaving the rest, your jobbing digger at the trench face on their starting pay of 19. So it's not an easy question to answer. I think I'll finish, and again, it's a debate, and the debate really is about who represents archaeologists, who puts the arguments. Are the arguments even put?
And
because
just on that, just my final thing on this would be just to say, because often the people who we rely on to make these arguments are in fairly well-paid positions. They're in the positions that are very high up that pay scale, and they seemingly are vulnerable to entering a culture where they feel as though change at the bottom is simply too difficult to make. Turning the ship around will upset the apple cart for example, for development archaeology, or for, I don't know, the perception of unity within the sector. And yet below that sort of level, there is a great deal of unity behind the simple fact that, and it's quite tragic actually, that within archaeology, it's almost a joke. It's almost, people sort of say, oh, well, obviously I didn't get into this for the money, or for the ability to have a. I mean, in the summer we were on location, and an archaeologist said to me, "Since when have archaeologists expected to be able to have a family?" This person said that to me, and they were not joking. They were in that instance, they were being deadly serious. So there's a risk that people, unfortunately, are inculcated into this culture of being unfairly paid, and higher up the spectrum, when people become increasingly comfortable, they don't want to be a loose cannon that rocks the boat, as it were. Anyway, that's my piece. Go ahead.
I'd just like to finish really with some more figures. These have been quoted by an archaeologist called Neb Saunders, who's involved in things like the Diggers Forum.
Yes.
And posted in June, in fact, on Badger, British Archaeological Jobs Resource, on the forum. He did an analysis of particularly the lower pay in the lower two grades. So starting with the practitioner, and he noted a couple of things. And again, we will link to the piece, but a couple of things struck me really quite strongly out of it. Firstly, that he said that quite a few employers take what he called the lazy option of basically adopting the CIFA minimum and saying that's our minimum.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
You know. So and although the CIFA minimum is a range for the PCIFA grade, they adopt the lower end of the grade and say that's it, job done.
And sorry, and so just to briefly add to that as well, that often presumably will be done without scrutiny as to the ruling of the minimum. So as we talked about in the 2018 document, when they're talking about how, oh yes, we've been asked, we've been asked to consider having this London minimum wage, but we're not going to. This is the number we're putting out. Presumably, if people are setting their standards based on that number, they may not look into what went into that reckoning. They may just simply adopt the number that's been put out. I think it's worthwhile just reflecting on that. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Now, the other interesting thing that Saunders' figures throw up is that the higher up the grades you go, it would appear that there is a difference between unionized workforces and non-unionized workforces, where the unionized workforces are paid more across all the grades, but the disparity at the bottom end is around about £100. Well, up at a higher rate, it's as much as £645 between unionized and non-unionized. The suggestion there being, if I'm not saying this, but people might want to consider going out and joining a union, and then negotiating collectively with their employer, because it does appear that unionized archaeologists do get paid more than non-unionized archaeologists.
Yeah.
But again, the thing that comes off the figures is just the disparity. There's no consistency. For example, again at supervisors, some are as low as 21,300.
Which is interesting, given that the lowest possible rate as of 2021 seemingly is 20,000. Was it 400? Just over 20,000. So that's about 1,000 difference between the lowest paid and a supervisor.
That's right, but whoop-de-doo, at the top end, somebody actually breaks the barrier for the national average and could get as much as 28,498. So that's a huge difference. That's £7,000 difference.
Yeah.
Doing the same job.
Yeah.
So yeah, look, I think short answer, it's a mess. And it is probably, if the profession is going to remain healthy, it's a mess that's going to have to be cleared up somehow or other. Otherwise, you're going to have, problems. I mean, there are already not enough archaeologists in the UK. It's been made a shortage profession by in terms of bringing archaeologists in from outside. I mean, in fact, a colleague of ours, Reese Booth, has just moved from Australia to begin work with an English contracting company.
Right.
So it's that's how it is. But you've got it's almost a perfect storm of an insecure profession, insecure in terms of the job security and pay and conditions and so on, which is under-resourced, understaffed. And you read the forums and you read the response to that Twitter feed that we started with, people are, or morale is, put it this way, not all that it should be.
No.
In as you said as well, and the tragedy of it is, as you said, is that looking at the qualifications people have had, the reasons people go into archaeology, people do go into archaeology as a vocation. It's they and it is a highly qualified profession, and look at the success of programs like Time Team and so on. It has a lot of public recognition, and people enjoy what we do.
So leading, therefore, maybe slightly trailing what we might be talking about next week. I suppose a question to consider here is the one that I keep on poking at, and that is who are we trusting to make these cases and to examine the health and viability, for example, of academic archaeology that feeds into this 96% qualification rate that seemingly is required to be an archaeologist in this country. Who do we rely on? Can we rely on them? And I suppose more broadly speaking, what are and should be our expectations and our options? I don't want to say anything else about that because I think there are some things that are still being finalised for next week's show, but it's going to be interesting to see the response, and hopefully by discussing this week, we've at the very least laid out the fact that we genuinely care, as we talked about in a previous watching brief not that long ago, about the quality of the profession. And quality, that is to say, the experience of being an archaeologist. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily exclusive quality gatekeeping. It's much more a case of what's it like to be an archaeologist and who supports us. And are the people who claim to have a status of high support actually doing as good a job as they could or should be doing? I'll stop there. I won't keep on talking. Is there anything you want to say about next week's watching brief, Andy?
No, only that. Look, I mean, when I tweeted this out the other day, and it's had a lot of traction. Mm-hmm. But the look, what I said was archaeology is done by people who deserve to own a proper living, except on both sides of the Atlantic, too many don't. And I think we have to ask why that is. And it's not enough just to ask why. We then have to say, what can we do about it?
Yeah. From your lips to the mothership. So, as ever, Andy, thank you for your time this week. Thank you guys for watching at home. Please do comment below and look forward to that watching brief special that's coming next week. We hope to have some contributors as well, other people commenting, so it should be interesting. And until next time, do take care, everyone. Bye-bye.